Hey everyone, in this video we're learning about objects, how to create them, how to use them, and why they're important in JavaScript. Now, objects, you can think of them as essentially a box that holds many values, and it's storing those values in a format of a key value pair. They're super important in grouping related data together. You can think of an object as really anything in the real world. So, that could be a product, a user, anything with a lot of details. And so if you've ever wondered how can apps or programs manage such complex ideas, a lot of times it's because of objects, this concept of object oriented programming. Now, in order to get into objects, we can go to sandbox 1. Here I have an object example. In this case, it's a product. And to create an object, you're using curly braces. And within curly braces, between them, you have key value pairs. You have a key on the left, a value on the right, separated by a colon. And in this case, we have some data about a product. In this case, a wireless mouse with some information about the price and whether it's available or in stock. Now, there's a lot of ways you can work with objects, and one of those is reading an object. So the first thing you want to do to read an object is use dot notation, and that can be say product, the name of the object, product in this case, followed by a dot, and then which key you want to get or access, the value within. And so product.name, we want to access that. And if we run this in the console, we'll see wireless mouse here. Now, on top of reading values, you can update them. And so let's say we wanted to update the price. And so what we would do is say product.price. And we would say $34.99 instead of $29.99. And then we can console.log this as well. And you'll see in the console, we get back $34.99. And you can think of the console, and we'll get into this more, but think of the console as really your bridge to the real world in a way. Where the console is just, on our end, but think of it, that we want to, show this data. So not just, have work with, the object in JavaScript, but we also want, eventually to display this information on a website. And so when we're console.logging, just kind of start to get a feel for, this data is going to the client, going to the user and their device. And so that's what we're doing here. Now, we did reading values, updating values. You also can add new properties to the object. And, that could be, let's say you have a form on your website and you want to add, data to the product. You can do that. And to add it, what we would do is we can say product followed by the dot again. And then let's say we want to add a color, and we'll say color black, like so. And if we console.log the product.color, we get back black. Lastly, if you want to remove a key value pair from the object, you can do that. And to delete, a property, what you're going to do is delete product. In this case, we can say product.inStock. We don't want to get rid of that. So we'll run that, and then we'll say console.log product.inStock, and you will see undefined in the console, and that's because we deleted in stock. It no longer exists in the object. Now, in addition to dot notation, you have bracket notation. And this is useful because you can't always use dot notation all the time. And one of the ways you would want to use bracket notation is, if you want to access, a property name that has a space or a special character. And so if we were to run this, you will see Alex Johnson in the console. If we were to do it the regular way, it wouldn't work. We would get like an error. just because we have that space. It's just not possible, and we're gonna have problems. It doesn't understand what we're doing. So it's really important to use bracket notation in this instance. Now, the other thing you might want to be doing as well with bracket notation is if you want to, let's say, store a property in a variable and access it dynamically. So let's say we have this product object, and we hop back into this example, and we want to store the price. So we have, const, a variable name of key, let's say, and we want to store price in the variable. And then later on, the console.log product key. And if we ran this, we will get back $34.99. And so this is another way the benefit of using bracket notation is when you have a variable involved and you want to access price that way. And it's the same as you see $34.99. It's the same as doing product.price this way. Now, we're learning about objects, how to work with them, but why exactly would we use objects? Well, objects help us manage real-world items with multiple pieces of info. So it's really more than just simple strings and numbers that we've learned earlier in prior videos. You can think of objects as being useful for, like I mentioned, products, for an e-commerce website, and the value of an object is, you're compiling a lot of useful information about one specific thing all in one place versus storing each property here separately. It would get kind of messy. And so the benefit of an object is it keeps it all bundled up really nicely. Now, what I think will be helpful to understand is, you get the idea of objects, but how does that exactly relate to the back end? How does an object connect with the back end? And an object connects with the back end in really two main ways. So first, an object is data you create. So if you were to have a form on your website, JavaScript then turns that form data into an object, and then you can send that over to the backend to save it in a database, for instance. So that's one way. You have a form on your website. The other way also is, data you receive. So sometimes, you're not really using a form to create data. You already have the data on the backend. You're just accessing it. So this could be, information about products, information about users, or even posts for a blog. And when your app is loading or your program, it's going to ask the backend for that data, and the backend will then send that as JSON, and that in turn is going to turn into JavaScript will turn that into an object to be able to work with it in its in this sandbox here. It's JSON information to be able to be sent. Once it gets received, it's going to turn it into JavaScript will turn it into an object, and then you can use it to then display or use however you want in your program. So basically, objects are just how your front end and back end talk to each other, and sending and receiving information to keep your app updated and also interactive. Now, with that in mind, I want to go into a little example of how exactly does data, now that we have this data from the back end, or we have created this object, how does it show up on the page? What can we do with these objects? And I have an example here. So essentially what we have is we have a HTML document, and it's really simple. We have a div with an ID of product name, which we'll use for the JavaScript to target. We have an empty div, and we have underneath just a script tag to link to the external script sheet. And so you'll see sandbox 3. And then in the JavaScript side of things, you'll see that we have a product of object. We've gotten this object. In this case, I've manually hard coded it here, but if you had a server, you would fetch that, pull it here. And then what we're doing is we're taking that product, we're getting the div from the HTML, so product name div, document.get element by ID, the product name, which comes from here, product name. We've grabbed that. And then what we've done is we've said, let's update the text within the div, and we're saying use the product.name that we get from the object. And so that's blending what we see visually with the HTML and what's working on, under the hood with the JavaScript. And what we see is wireless mouse in the browser. And that's working because we're using both HTML and JavaScript together. Okay. So objects, to really wrap up, objects are pretty much everywhere in JavaScript because they help us organize complex data a lot more robust and useful than just a simple, number or string. It's able to, an object's great for, working with data, that information that's getting sent back and forth between the front end and back end, and, update what users see on the page. And so objects play a huge role in all of that. And when you start to understand objects, it's going to open the door to building more and more powerful programs and applications. So that's it for today. If this helped you understand objects better, feel free to hit like and subscribe, and also comment below if you want me to explain more JavaScript basics and what you're enjoying about the series. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.